Hi there, this is producer Ethan Shanty with just a little editorial note before the show starts. You're going to hear me and Mitch talk a lot about this program called The Summer I Turned Pretty, and what I'm referencing throughout the course of the conversation is in actuality a Netflix program called Never Have I Ever. So anytime we say The Summer I Turned Pretty, you'll know that I'm actually talking about Never Have I Ever. It kind of ruins the basis of our entire conversation, but we think it's funny, so we're going to leave it in. Now, here's Northwards.
The real world shows that ridiculous people come to power all the time, you know? That was one strand of it, just thinking about what does it mean for a person to seek to be a leader of men? And the principal character, this young woman named Xena, she sees this dynamic unfolding of a person wielding power over others, and she's really attracted to that.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities. Is this thing on?
Are we rolling, Mr. Coppola?
Who's Mr. Coppola? Am I too young for that reference?
I don't know. Are you not familiar with the
Francis Ford
Coppola? Yeah.
Let's move on from it.
You were thinking I was referring to Sophia by the wrong pronoun?
No, I was thinking you were, doing some Welcome Back Kotter stuff. I don't know.
All right, so look at my arm here. You see this indentation?
I do see that.
Okay, so clearly it is from a button on my
button on
shirt.
your Hawaiian shirt.
But in what set of circumstances could the inside of my right wrist have been pushing so hard against the buttons on my Hawaiian shirt that it would have left an indentation?
I think your skin as you get older is just becoming softer.
More malleable.
Yeah, you're becoming Play-Doh day by day.
I'm demonstrating this in the studio, and I have no idea.
Wait, okay. When you walked into the building, what were you carrying?
I was carrying my my messenger bag,
okay,
and I was carrying my phone.
You weren't like cradling something in the crook of your arm and pressing?
I was not. Well, I don't have buttons on the crook of my arm.
No, but anyway, another Twilight Zone mystery we'll never solve.
Well, so and it brings up this shirt that I'm wearing, right?
Yeah.
The shirt that I'm wearing.
It's not an inherently funny shirt, but I am very amused by it because it's from the American Eagle, The Summer I Turned Pretty line.
Yeah, and so to give you listeners some background on this shirt, I was at an outlet mall in Ottawa like a year and a half ago, and I'm sure we went into American Eagle because one of my kids was looking for clothes, because it's not really the store that caters to the 50-something crowd.
Does it still smell like Axe in there?
No, but it does still sound like techno music.
I can count on one hand the number of times I've been in American Eagle, and it always freaks me out because I feel like they know I'm not supposed to be in there, and I know I'm not supposed to be in there. And look at me.
The trick is to be a parent, which there should be like a special section of American Eagle for the dads who have brought their children into the store, because anyway.
Right, and they give you a VR headset, and the VR headset looks like an old clothing shop from the 50s, where
a haberdashery,
and you're trying to buy shoes, but you didn't bring in socks, so they give you the store sock.
The
smoking
little,
a cigarette.
Yeah.
What are we talking about?
I needed a shirt, right? I don't even know that I needed a shirt, but I like this shirt. It's a Hawaiian print shirt. It's a good shirt. Yeah, it's got your aquas. It's got some bright flowers on it. It's perfect for summer. And yet, I had no idea when I bought it, aside from the fact that the label said The Summer I Turned Pretty. I'm like, well, that's ironic, right? Because what would be the summer that a 50-something-year-old guy turned pretty? When I decided to shave my head, perhaps.
Maybe, or, a summer like 40 years ago.
Did you? I mean, could you tell could you tell that I was prettier today than the last time you saw me?
Literally. I don't think you can ask me that question without an HR representative present.
So the shirt did not do its job here. And then so we were talking about this the Summer I Turned Pretty concept, and I was not even aware that it was either A book, or B a TV show.
A TV show on Netflix, yeah, with written by Mindy Kaling and narrated by John McEnroe. And I figured maybe you.
It was narrated by John McEnroe.
He's the narrator behind.
You made
this.
a John. So we were talking about this on our messaging app, right? And you mentioned John McEnroe, and I was like,
you were like, what the hell does that have to do with anything?
It must be set in the 80s. Was it set in the 80s?
No, is it? No, I think it's set in the 2000s. I don't know. Aaron watched it, but I think John McEnroe is the narrator because her dad was a tennis guy or something. I don't know. It's a funny juxtaposition. This teenage girl who's navigating social circles in high school being narrated by this guy who's famously angry in tennis.
Yeah, that is an interesting juxtaposition. Right.
Anyway,
they couldn't. So the Canadian version undoubtedly is narrated by a hockey player, right?
Definitely is. Yeah. By Wayne Gretzky.
Yeah.
Anyway, you told me yesterday that your T-shirt is from the Summer I Turned Pretty line.
It's a button down. Yes,
whatever.
You're wearing a T-shirt.
Yes, I am. But
it is not from the Summer I Turned Pretty line.
I really desperately want to wear the only Hawaiian shirt that I own into the office. However, I cannot because it is covered in guns.
I think we might have had that conversation.
We did at our retreat. Yeah.
So I was not familiar with this show. Is the show disturbing in any way? Or
no, it's funny.
It's a funny show.
Yeah.
As you would imagine, with being written by Mindy Kaling
and John McEnroe narrating a teenage girl's life. Yeah.
Is John McEnroe like 80 years old now?
How old is John McEnroe?
You Google that while we continue to talk at random for a few minutes leading into this episode of Northwards, in which we interview Rob Benvie.
Who is not 66 years old, but John McEnroe is.
John McEnroe, he's only 66.
66.
Yeah.
Look at this photo of him with this mullet, with this curly mullet.
Yeah. So it's not disturbing, and that actually kind of sets it apart from many shows because we were having a conversation down the hall just before we walked into Studio A here at North Country Public Radio.
Yeah, Anna was telling us about Severance. I was talking about Twin Peaks, which was disturbing.
And then you were talking about The Bear.
The Bear, which, as we speak, is coming out today in its 4th season or its 5th season. I don't know. And I was telling you that if you want to have a bad time, you should watch The Bear. And I frequently do want to have a bad time, which is why I'm excited for The Bear.
Yeah, well, and so, and I am famous for not wanting to have a bad time while I'm watching television anyway. And I was making the comment that why are all shows today so disturbing? But apparently The Summer I Turned Pretty is not disturbing. And I was a Twin Peaks fan back in the day. I mean, I remember my college friends and the bunch of us, this group of friends from college, we would gather in somebody's dorm room and watch Twin Peaks on whatever it was, like Sunday night, I think.
On ABC.
Yeah, on ABC, exactly.
When I watched, so it took me a really, really, really long time to watch Twin Peaks, and 3 different tries of the pilot before I got all the way through it, because the tone of the show switches on a dime. It's so tonally confusing, and the narrative is confusing, and the characters are as well. Everything about the show.
John McEnroe does not narrate Twin Peaks,
unfortunately. But
although that would give it another feel altogether.
That's the special fan edit of the show. But my biggest takeaway was like, I cannot believe this was on primetime television in the 90s, because it's really dark, and of course there were supernatural programs as well, but nothing quite so esoteric as Twin Peaks.
It was definitely an outlier in 1991 or 92 or whenever we were watching, probably both.
Yeah. I can't believe that anyone ever gave David Lynch money, because I mean, he deserves it. He's a great filmmaker. But he is a singular entity, right? Like, his vision is his own, and it doesn't jive with pretty much anybody else on the planet. So, like, I don't know. I just realized that you either are into David Lynch or you're not, and I don't think there's very much in between.
Yeah, well, you got to think that if Twin Peaks were dreamed up today, it would be an HBO series
definitely.
Or an Apple TV series.
Well, and when it came back, it was on Showtime. So,
that's right.
Yeah, it definitely would not be on a primetime it would be on a prestige network. Yeah.
Yeah. But the interesting thing is, and again, I'm famous for not wanting to have a disturbing time while I'm watching television. Mm-hmm. I don't have the same qualms, I don't think, about reading books, at least reading fiction.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. Maybe it's the slow burn of a book that maybe it's like my brain has a way of insulating myself by creating images that, while disturbing, aren't as disturbing as whatever the director is putting in front of me on a TV show or a movie or whatever.
I think also maybe there's like a safety in your own imagination. Of course, the horrors that you can imagine are often worse than what's happening in the real world.
That was actually originally a Shakespeare quote, right?
Yes, Bill Shakespeare, for those uninitiated. But I think that, even if you're reading a disturbing passage on the page, your brain can tell you, oh, it's just words.
Yeah.
You can choose to like self-censor your imagination. Whereas if you're watching someone's head be cut off on television, I guess you could close your eyes, but you can't unsee it. Maybe that's it.
My wife is very good at closing her eyes at those scenes and asking the people in the room to tell her when it is over. I mean, people getting their heads cut off or somebody just getting like an IV inserted.
What is the scariest thing you've ever seen in a movie or a television program?
Let's save that for the end of this episode.
Okay, I'm not going to tell you mine because I refuse to talk about it, but I'll talk about the second scariest thing.
Oh, all right.
At the end of the show.
So there's a lot that's disturbing in Rob Benvie's new book, The Damagers. It's a novel that plays out in the North Country, actually. Rob Benvie is Canadian, grew up in Nova Scotia, lives in the Toronto area now. The book, actually, interestingly enough, is not available in U.S. bookstores yet. They're working on that. But folks who are especially interested, I mean, you can still buy it online in the United States.
Right.
Or what do they call it at libraries? Rent it?
Borrow.
Borrow. That's the word I was looking for. Sorry, the verbs are the first thing to go, Ethan. Anyhow, it involves a couple, and he'll explain the book better than I can in a nutshell here, but a couple of youngish girls, one a teenager, the other an adolescent, who are fleeing from something, and we're not really sure what it is at this point, but it involves a fire, and they kind of happen upon an intentional community, if you will, in the woods of the Adirondacks that turns out to be a quasi-religious cult. And
I was going to say intentional community is a nice euphemism for cult.
Well, yeah, but it's not immediately apparent that it's a cult. And anyway, but I think you read the book and you figure out fairly quickly that something is not entirely right here. But the book doesn't necessarily. It gets into a lot of theory. Maybe it goes into the philosophy of power and
those types of personalities that would seek out power and want to control others.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really. And see, it's disturbing in some ways, but it's also a really captivating read. And it was a really nice opportunity to talk with a really interesting guy, Rob Benvie. Welcome to Northwoods. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Was the experience writing this book as intense as the experience for readers?
That's an interesting question. I mean, the realistic answer would be writing a book is a lot of solo downtime, concentration, tapping away, typing away. But I think it was intense in that I was trying to draw together a few disparate strands, historically, imaginatively, sort of politically, while at the same time making a sincere attempt to write a good story, a gripping story that sort of had some propulsion to it. And following some of the sort of, I would sort of use the word elemental to describe the book, in that I had wanted it to structurally, it's structured in the 4 seasons of a year, and it's very much about an encounter with nature, and so these sort of and the weather, these sort of basic fundamental forces. And so I think the intensity came from trying to make all these different things I was interested in cohere and not feel too forced.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I'm not so naive as to imagine that you were up until 3 o'clock in the morning pounding away at the keyboard, Mozart-like. Well, and I'm usually loath to take someone else's quote for an interview, but the thing that grabbed me in a really brief description that I think was just in the last couple of days in the Globe and Mail was that the elevator pitch could have been Manson sets up camp at Walden Pond. And I don't know if that's exactly fair, but there is something to the idea that you have these kind of two contrasting ideas. You mentioned the struggle against nature, and there are these archetypes in fiction, man against man, man against nature. And you have both going on in this one place.
Yeah, yes. And so the Manson family at Walden, sort of does the trick in sort of describing the events of what happens. I was sort of conscious about the place that cults have taken in sort of pop culture now. I wasn't all that interested in this community portraying it as a cult, like that sort of narrative about what happens to the individual mind among a cult. I feel has been done a lot and done better than I could do it. I don't have any particular intimate knowledge with cults, but I was more about interested in this sort of utopian idealism, and that kind of comes from a long history in America. I know you're based in the States, but also a bit in Canada. There's this history of these intentional communities trying to apply sort of a political, social vision in their own little town or village, or in this case, sort of a camp. And so the Manson thing is like, it's not quite in that horrific, though there is, violence and bloodshed. I would sort of push back on the Charles Manson comparison, because I think the leader of this group that I've portrayed, he's at once charismatic. He's also somewhat of a buffoon, and so that sort of tug and pull of, is he for real? Why would a sane person can't help but wonder, why did anybody follow this? Why did anybody swallow this and believe it? And so I wanted this to be believable. I don't know if Charles Manson figures come and go all the time, so people fall under their spell. But it was a little bit less about that and more about, the struggle for power, both within this little community between the principal characters, and how they're sort of at the mercy of their environment, the mercy of nature, the mercy of the broader political transformation that's happening in the country around them, that's sort of encroaching on their little, utopia. But the Walden thing is definitely part of it. I mean, I was trying to invoke, a certain strain of transcendental American romantic thought filtered down through, the European romantics to, like, Walt Whitman is name-checked a lot in the book, and Emerson and Thoreau, those guys. So that's definitely part of it for sure.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, thinking about the stuff that you explore, I would imagine that just about anything going on in the world today could have gotten you thinking about a lot of it and gotten you to start writing. But was there a particular spark for this was there a particular spark that got the Damagers in motion?
It was a few different things, but I would say, the very beginning of it, when I first started writing it or started thinking about it, was close to the beginning of the first Trump era. When you're writing novels like I do, like fiction that are, story driven, sort of the raw matter that you work with is human nature. And so the dismaying, but also very interesting thing about the Trump era that we live in, like it or not, we live in that era, is that it really lays bare how the world is shaped by human nature. There's this person, and it's always been the case, but it's just really obvious and explicit now, that the sort of gripes and pettiness of this one individual then has this broad effect that shapes the entire world. And that's happened. It's happening. It's happened all throughout history, but it's just so obvious now. So that was one spark, in that thinking about the leader of this group, that he can be very flawed and in some ways kind of ridiculous. But the real world shows that ridiculous people come to power all the time, and so that was one strand of it, just thinking about, what does it mean for a person to seek to be a leader of men, like people like myself or anyone I know, we don't aspire to rule over our fellow man, but many people in this world do. And that's something that occurs in this novel, but also in real life. And the principal character, this young woman named Xena, she's a very, smart, intelligent teenage girl, and she sees this dynamic unfolding of a person wielding power over others, and she's really attracted to that. And so she wants some of that, because, as the story unfolds, you sort of learn how she saw her own father and to a lesser degree her mother, but as these sort of weak people. And her father was weak. He was, came home from World War II, shell-shocked, traumatized, and changed irrevocably. And he just, bad stuff happens. You have to read the book to find out. But and whereas this character Peter, who's the leader of this community she joins, he is just very kind of cavalier with his ambitions. He just tells everyone, you have to have faith in me. Lay your preconceptions aside, follow me, and everything will be good. Which is, to me, such a deranged view of the world, or a deranged personality trait to have, but people have it, So that was one strand of it, of just thinking about what does it mean for someone to seek power over others, to be that kind of a leader.
Well, and in fact, I have a note written down that says, Peter equals charismatic, insane, or both.
Yeah, and then there's even a hint that maybe that some of his charisma might even verge on the sort of supernatural. He has these sort of he claims to have these visions, but he also has this very persuasive view of people. There's a couple scenes where, he actually does have, there is something there to him. It's not all just big talk. And I think when we think of these strange and befuddling charismatic leaders who somehow take power, like a Trump figure, it's easy for us to say, how could anybody fall for that? But there's an attraction there, that he answers a question that people are asking. The world we live in is confusing and strange and constantly changing and hard to understand. And that's a challenge we all face. It's just how do we live in this society without going insane?
So why the Adirondacks and why the 1950s?
The 50s was sort of the beginning of individualism. And you had these sort of I was thinking of Neil Cassidy or proto-hippie types who were sort of, and they were drawing upon Whitman and these people who were looking at, the self. The self creates the world, and to privilege yourself above all else and to understand yourself, which is not on its own a bad thing. We should all practice a little bit of self-awareness and self-pride, I guess. But then, that as a society, that creates a very individualistic, competitive, me world. And even among sort of progressive-minded people, that translated into kind of the hippie movements and the New Age movements. Again, they have their appeals, and there's good and interesting things about that stuff. But it creates a very self-privileging mentality. But I was just sort of playing with the idea that originates, or at least really takes form after the war, after World War II. Now, I'm not a historian. I'm barely an academic, so people could dispute my claims, and my research was haphazard and all over the place. Your listeners who live closer to the Adirondacks might take issue with the way I'm portraying the landscape. I've been there, I go there all the time and been there. So it's one perspective, but I was less beholden to the truth and more of an interpretation of how I was seeing that time period in that setting.
I will say, I don't think you got the Adirondacks wrong.
Yeah, I travel to that neck of the woods relatively often. My wife is from Quebec, and so I know that side of the mountains better. We travel. I'll be traveling there tomorrow, actually. And I've driven it. I've traveled around New York State quite a lot. So it's less. The research was more just experiential, just seeing it and just realizing, now, but especially 50, 60 years ago, there's so much wilderness in the United States and in Canada, obviously. But in this, supposedly, New York State is a very developed state. It's very urban. But there's also huge tracts of wilderness, and even more so back then. There weren't highways connecting everything in the 50s. That was a new thing. That sort of plays a part in the story too. And so you just gaze upon these beautiful mountains, and I just thought, someone could get lost in there. In 2025, it's harder and harder for people to get lost in the world. We have technology that prevents us from, or helps us to not get lost, but you can get lost, and being lost in the hills, in the mountains. That was one of the sparks that started. It was just this image of these sisters lost in the woods and no idea where it lies ahead of them.
Well, literally lost and also metaphorically lost.
Yes, exactly. The security of their home is gone. The security of their parents is gone. And I sort of thought of it as, it's like Hansel and Gretel or fairy tale beginning. Two girls run off into the woods. What's going to happen to them? Well, chances are something bad.
You mentioned earlier that Xena is she's a smart girl. She's very well read, and at the same time, because she and her sister Presendia were so sheltered, they also enter this compound, this cult, whatever you want to call them, with a certain amount of naivete that allows the experience to shape them in a way that the other people who have come there might not be shaped by.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I didn't want this camp to feel like a really crude allegory. Like every character represents something else, like in a kind of, like Animal Farm or something like that, But there's a little bit of that. There's a diverse range of people who show up at this camp or inhabit this camp, and they have differing viewpoints of why they're there and what they believe in. And so, yeah, it's this eye-opening experience for the two girls, especially the older of the two, because she barely knows anything. Her experience of the world is books. And this is the 50s, like this has been discussed a lot too in pop culture, how like the concept of the teenager hadn't really existed yet, So there was no, you were a child or you were a young woman, and she's right on that brink. She's a young woman, really. She's not like, it's hard to imagine 15-year-olds today acting the way she does. 15-year-olds are very intelligent, but it was a different time, and so that was part of another of the many strands that kind of came together. I wanted her to feel believable, not like some precocious, smart mouth kid who's, that's sort of a cliche of the child who sees what the adults cannot. But there's a bit of that, and she's wise and she's perceptive and she identifies, okay, this is who is really in charge here. Here's the people I should take seriously, and some of these people I just don't take seriously.
Yeah, perceptive is a really great word there.
Right, yeah, she's got a perception, but not the experience, And so later in the book, they travel to the cities, and it's just she's never seen an elevator. She's never really interacted with people of color, like she's totally naive, but isn't necessarily intimidated by it because she doesn't see any reason to be intimidated by it. She just, okay, this is another thing for me to wrestle with.
Was it significant that this place, this group, the compound, the camp, whatever, you never give it a name?
They never really have a proper name. They live on a lake called Lake Tenskwatawa, which, I will reveal is fictional because I didn't want it to be a specific place. But it's, modeled after real places. But they don't have a specific name. The first drafts of this book were not that different from the final book. It didn't change that too much in the story, but it's one thing that kind of shifted. And my editor at Knopf is a really smart dude, and one thing that kind of shifted is that it veered a little bit away from the explicitly religious aspect and a bit more into the political. Like the earliest incarnation of this whole community, I had made very specifically or very consciously. It's such a mishmash of ideologies and beliefs. They're in one way they're Christian, but they're also kind of socialist, and that's inspired by a mishmash of real communities that had existed. The Millerites and the Oneidas and these things in history. I wanted to make my own. I imagined my own community, and so theirs is a very mishmash. And then they're also inspired by sort of esoteric religions and stuff, and it's all over the place. I preserved that, but I shifted a little bit away from them being, they refer to this group as the flock, which is, a very Christian way of looking at things. But I dialed that back a little bit in the final version because the aspect of it that became a bit more interesting was the kind of utopian aspect. And they're, as you revealed, they have plans to impose their vision on the world. And that aspect became a bit more interesting to me than just a community of faithful sheep,
Right. Well, but you did give them kind of their own, if not language, their own vernacular, their own terminology for describing how this society that they're creating would operate.
Yeah, and again, because that was my own invention, but it was modeled pretty openly on what I was talking about before, these sort of like proto-hippie, proto-new age movements of the 60s and 70s, like the Esalen Institute. There's really great footage you can find online or wherever of these sort of exercises that these new age groups would do about sort of drawing. It's almost like a weird sort of talk therapy, but it's all about sort of like bringing out your inner self and identifying yourself and loving your inner self and, almost like making love to yourself. And that's what I was talking about when I was saying, trying to imagine a continuum from romanticism through the war, through, 50s, 60s counterculture to 70s, 80s hedonism. That was my invention to sort of show how that mentality could have been fostered.
There's an inherent irony in a group of people who are brought together by the principle of loving themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's a funny conundrum that happens in our world today. We talk together. There's always an emphasis on community in Western societies, and working together, and patriotism is a huge force in both our countries. But at the same time, it's all about finding in social media, and these things are all about the exaltation of the self, and everyone is to be celebrated. Everyone's a celebrity. Everyone's amazing and great. And there's I don't think this book is an attempt to to reject that. It's just something that happens, and if you look at, large mass political movements, there's always a tug and pull between that, and the cult of personality concept is all about an exaltation of a self, and yet also you are expected to give yourself over to this principle. And one could say, the arguable ineffectiveness of progressive movements in North America right now is about that confusion. We're all about ourselves, and we don't believe in working together and solidarity is maybe as much as in generations past. One could quibble with that. I'm not going to say that is definitive, but it's it's definitely something to think about. And again, yeah. So I wasn't trying to make their community an allegory for America as a whole, but to some degree that exists, is part of it, to sort of think of this microcosmic society, and the things that are shaping their little society are the same things that shape our bigger society.
Maybe inadvertent allegory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which would be a great band name as I sit here and think about it.
They're great. They're really tight and heavy, and I think they're from Portland. I think got some crazy time signatures. They're great.
They're all from Portland.
Yeah.
Well, and I hope you will forgive me for not really knowing your writing or your music career before this book, but there's this border that apparently prohibited me from knowing anything before now. Two questions. One, how do you compare what you do as a writer, the kind of the solitary life of a writer, as you describe it, with what your life was like as a rock musician?
They're very different in many ways. Your listeners are very forgiven to not know me as a musician. Most of the stuff I did was mostly based in Canada. I certainly toured a lot outside Canada as well, but certainly not a household name. But from my teens into my 30s, I played in bands and made records and toured a lot. It's very different because certainly in a rock band setting, it's collaborative, and just managing the dynamics in a group are sometimes the biggest task. Whereas when you're by yourself writing a book, it's much more just on you, and the creative experience is probably a little more undistilled. It's sort of more of a pure creative experience. Writing novels is kind of, it's just you and the page. Whereas making music, you're in studios, there's technology, there's shows, there's logistics, there's working together and all that stuff too. But in the certain comparing writing fiction and writing songs, in many ways, there's more differences than similarities in my mind. Great music. People have asked me before about lyrics, like what are great lyrics? What makes great lyrics? And I'm kind of like, lyrics sometimes don't matter, or and if they do, it's usually brevity or concision that really makes great song lyrics, versus what the kind of writing I do. It's a little florid, sometimes to a fault, but I'll accept that. Concision isn't always the mandate when you're writing a novel. It's good to be concise and precise, but you can digress a little bit more in terms of the words. Great song, like pop or rock song lyrics, sometimes they can be the best songs have really asinine lyrics, so and then bands or writers who are considered very literary sometimes can be kind of cringe-inducing. So in terms of the actual writing, I don't see a whole lot of comparisons, but I mean I guess there's probably something there, a love of language, a love of the way sentences fit together in the same way that a line in a song fits together. There's I get a pleasure out of that, of putting together a good refrain or a good paragraph.
Well, and do I have this right? You in some of the other pieces of fiction you've written before, you've actually sort of simultaneously written songs, or you had a soundtrack to them?
Yeah, well, I've done a few little hybrid things like that. So this is actually my fourth book, but it's my first with a larger publisher. So up until now, I've been working more with sort of indie presses. And to coincide with the release of one of them, I did a soundtrack. So I sort of composed a bunch of music and put that out, and it explicitly went along with the book. The songs matched the book kind of. Obviously, the album was only about an hour, and reading the book would take you longer than that. But it was sort of just as a fun to broaden the experience. And then for my last book, so that was my second book, and then my last book, Bleeding Light, I kind of wanted to do a soundtrack for it, but I didn't want to do it all myself. And it was during COVID, and so I put out the word to a bunch of my musician friends, and luckily, I guess everyone had a lot of time on their hands because people provided, and so there was a soundtrack to that. Some people wrote songs and music explicitly for it, and some just adapted things they already had. And we just pretended they were about it, but and it really came together really well. So you can find that on like Bandcamp and things like that. But it was great. I mean, it's like people really came together, and it's got some really hotshot musicians to make some songs. And that's a fun thing. We didn't do it for this book. Not the thought sort of crossed my mind, but I kind of those things can also sort of distract a little bit. And they're also a lot of work. Again, so far I haven't done any music for this, but you never know.
Do you listen to music when you write?
Sometimes, but when I listen to music, I'm pretty a close listener. My wife and I'll be out for dinner, and I'll just be like, if I hear a song like in the restaurant, I can't. I need to listen to it if it's something. So often I'll try to, and I'll just get distracted, especially if it's something with a little bit of lyrics. So when I do, it's usually like instrumental or maybe ambient or something. But I do, and there's inspiration there to be found. But yeah, I'll just get too distracted. I'll start thinking about that, and then the next thing I know, I'm like, looking things up, and I'm gone down a rabbit hole of distraction. And that happens a lot.
Well, and so maybe the question that comes out of all this is, for as different as writing songs and writing a full-on novel are you expressing, do you feel like writing fiction allows you to express yourself more or just differently?
I think as time goes on, I would say more. There's always a sort of degree of doubt, self-doubt, and imposter syndrome. You're always sort of like, am I a real writer? And even though I've been publishing stuff for like 20 years. Only pretty recently do I've felt kind of confident in what I'm doing and feel like more at ease in situations like this talking about it. I just we get so frazzled so quickly talking about anything I'm working on. Maybe that has to do with being more of a professional, but I also sort of worry that professionalism can be sort of the death knell of an artist in many ways if you're thinking too much about your career. That's definitely something that I've seen and experienced a bit in music, is that people, very gifted, talented people, but they start just doubting themselves because they're thinking too much about their label and their audience and their, reception, and what's the best next move for me to do? What should I be doing to make my career make sense? And a bit of that is smart. You got to be savvy and play your cards right. But I think, you always want to maintain that kind of innocence going into a creative project and just do it because you like to do it above all, not necessarily because you got to pay the bills. I mean, that's when you can't pay the bills doing it, that's great. But so, maybe in my experience as a musician where I band I had, at one point was signed to a big American major label, and we went through that whole experience, which is, horrific and fun and hilarious and depressing. And then so I've run the gamut of playing, stadiums to playing to nobody. And, and what came out of that for me is just like, well, you just got to find the aspects of things that you love to do. Like, there's no, I mean, it sounds like it's a horrible cliche, but it's really true. It's like you have to genuinely like what you're doing. You have to set up yourself. So, writing is hard. Writing a novel is hard. But I find pleasurable work. It's frustrating at times, but I genuinely like doing it. And I try to make it so, like, how can I set myself up for success and not failure? Like, how can I make sure I'm concentrating on the right things, the actual writing and not other distractions and things. And I think those were lessons I learned as a musician. Just, you have to do it for the love of it. And there's no way around it.
The gratification of the crowd is a much different thing, though, in music than it is, when you finish a book.
It really is. I mean, again, none of the bands or projects that I've been involved in were necessarily huge, but I've had the opportunity to play to, huge audiences in my life. And I'm not the kind of person that like thrives on that. That's not why I would do these things. And we did a little launch for the Damagers here in Toronto the other night. And, it's like it's a small crowd, it's a bookstore, but it was full. And, that meant more to me than some huge, massive audience, like that my friends and a few civilians actually came out and were paying attention, and like that. It's more personal for me, at least, and that's the stuff that kind of warms my heart more so than followers on the internet or something.
You didn't need them holding up lighters at the end of your reading.
I didn't. That would have been pretty cool though, but we didn't. Yeah, and no one was screaming encore at the end. They had enough.
Well, listen, Rob Benvie, really, it's an amazing book, and it was a really intense experience reading it. I'm grateful for the chance to get to know you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, and really appreciate coming on.
Thrush Hermit taking us out of this interview with Rob Benvie, the author of The Damagers. Thrush Hermit, Rob Benvie's band from the 90s, and a track called Western Dreams in that great 1990s way of spelling dreams, D-R-E-A-M-Z. If you're especially interested, you can find Thrush Hermit's music still out in the interwebs on Spotify and YouTube Music and all those places. Or you'll find a link to more about The Damagers, Rob Benvie, and everything else you might want to know at ncpr.org/northwards. Producer Ethan Shanty is back in the studio with us. And Ethan, you were asking me what the most disturbing thing that I have seen either on television or in a movie has been, and at my advanced age, my tolerance. I think it's the issue right. Is I was much more open to seeing disturbing things in my younger years, and maybe it's just the cumulative effects of being 56.
Sure. Yeah, I think
56,
at 19.
Yeah, I am 56.
Yeah, at like 19 or 20, you definitely have a greater capacity for witnessing horrors and stuff and not letting it ruin your life.
So with that in mind, I was 17, 18,
okay.
maybe even 16, and it was actually a made-for-TV movie called Special Bulletin.
Okay.
And it was about this group of, like, American terrorists, I think. It was terrorists of some kind who had somehow gotten a hold of a small nuclear weapon and were threatening to detonate it. And the whole thing was done in POV style by from a bunch of young journalists. And I feel like it was going on at a pier someplace. They had seized control of the terrorists had seized control of an aircraft carrier or a destroyer or something like that. And spoiler alert, the bomb actually gets detonated. And, up until that point, the young journalists who were shooting the story and narrating it go into it are like, they feel, indestructible.
Yeah, they're invincible because they're young and they're
Right. And we see them in the immediate aftermath of this bomb going off. And it just scared the crap out of me and it was also at a time, flash forward, 35 or 40 years, and we're sort of, talking about this stuff again. But it was definitely at a time when we were all insecure about the possibility of nuclear winter. Like that was a topic for discussion in political campaigns. Like, what would we do about, disarming the Soviets? And so it definitely played into to a major case of existential dread at the time.
For me, I've been sitting here thinking, my very first thought was, I've seen a lot of French horror movies, and the French really are pretty good at disturbing you. They're on a different level of existential dread over there.
The fine cheeses.
The wine, the cigarettes, inventing democracy.
Napoleon.
There's a couple that come to the front of my mind, one of which is The Deer Hunter, which I've vowed to never watch again. One of the most disturbing things I've ever seen. Requiem for a Dream. Have you ever seen that? About New York City kids using heroin. I made sure that I would never use heroin. So
your own personal scared straight.
It worked. But I think, honestly, the most disturbing thing I've ever seen on film is a French horror movie. And it's not just because it's bloody and gory and violent, but I'm not going to spoil the ending. But it left me with...
Keeping in mind that you haven't named the film.
Oh, yeah. I'm so disturbed by it, I don't even want to say it.
The film that shall not be named.
It's this French horror movie called Martyrs. And what starts off as a pretty standard horror flick devolves into something that had me almost crying.
Oh, my.
And like tucked into the corner of my couch. It just left me with this profound feeling of like hopelessness. And I think, thinking about The Deer Hunter or Requiem for a Dream or all those other movies that have affected me, I think that's the one quality more than violence or gore that really impacts me, is that feeling of hopelessness. So it's one of the best movies I've ever seen in my life, but I cannot recommend it at all to anyone because...
I feel that way about the Harlem Globetrotters on Gilligan's Island.
The horror. Okay.
Take us out.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, produced, and edited by Mitch Teich with digital production supervision by me. I'm Ethan Shanty. To learn more about this show, listen to past conversations, and to make a contribution, head to ncpr.org/northwards. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.